Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the preview to the Classics Today Insider subscriber video on Raphael Kubelik's 10 Best Recordings. And if you are not an Insider subscriber, do please consider signing up. There is a link in the description of this video down below, or you can just go to the ClassicsToday.com homepage where you can sign up there. Now, Raphael Kubelik, it's only been, it's only been somewhat recently that we've been able to really get a broad perspective on his legacy, because he was a wanderer. For all the years he spent in Bavarian Radio, and there were a lot. That was the central core of his being for many, many years. But it took him a long time to get established. He was a slow developer, and he sort of dribbled recordings wherever he went. So there's a box on EMI, and there's a box on Decca, and there's the Mercury Living Present stuff in Chicago, and there's a box of live stuff on Orfeo, and then there's the big DG box. There's a lot of boxes. There's a lot of stuff. And he's really almost the poster child for my contention that you should never, ever use nationalist origins to pigeonhole or prejudice your view of a particular artist. Kubelik was Czech. He left Czechoslovakia when the communists took over, vowing never to return while they were there, and was persona non grata there at the time. During the communist regime. When the Berlin Wall fell and all that stuff happened, he went back for a series of celebrated concerts, which were recorded, and they're on Denon. But it was music he'd done 100 times before. I know some people find his Ma Vlast that he did in Prague, to be uniquely emotional, and the historical occasion certainly was. I don't think it's his best performance. It may have been his most meaningful performance for him, and maybe for some others as well. I can't second guess anybody's opinion about that. But my point with him is that he spent a good couple of decades sort of wandering about before he actually got to Bavarian Radio, where he finally was happy. And he was happy for a particular reason. It was because of the kind of artist he was. Everybody expected him, of course, to do Czech music, which he did extremely well. He made 5, 6 recordings of Smetana's Ma Vlast. It's just ridiculous. There's every 5 minutes he was dropping another Ma Vlast. That's what he was expected to do. But he was, in many ways, a genuine musical intellectual. His father, Jan Kubelik, was the famous violinist. He grew up in a musical family. He was a composer. He wrote 3 requiem settings for some reason. I don't know who was dying or who he was doing it for, but he did. And quite a few other pieces, and some of them actually have been recorded, and they're not bad. He was not a bad composer at all. But his interests were so much broader than just doing the same old Czech stuff. He was dogged by a lot of personal issues. He was not an easy guy to get along with. He spent some time in England at Covent Garden. He spent some time, he was supposed to take over the Met, but he didn't do that. And because the producer, the general director, was his name Goran, whatever his name was, he died suddenly, and Kubelik said the heck with it. He was not given to putting up with the bureaucracy of the arts world very much. And so a position with a German radio orchestra where he could simply do everything and anything he wanted for broadcast and pursue all kinds of interesting repertoire, it was perfect for him. Absolutely perfect for him. And so when he finally got to Bavarian Radio, he started doing all kinds of interesting things. And he was able to pursue his interest both in orchestral music and opera, because he was a wonderful operatic conductor, a wonderful theater conductor. But he never really managed to keep a post at an opera house, because who would put up with it? So he did these things in concert, and he did them extraordinarily well. He really did. But it's, like I said, difficult to wrap your brain around all of his stuff. He had a particular affinity, I think, for 20th century music, generally. Now, some of that was Czech. You have composers like Janáček and Martinu, but he was very, very interested in that sort of turn of the century, he did the three, let's put it this way, he did the three great German, what would you call them, the aesthetic, intellectual opera type things. We're talking about Fitzner's Palestrina and Hindemith's Mattis der Maler and Busoni's Dr. Faustus. I mean, he was interested in all of these off the beaten path pieces, big works that other people tended not to do. And the combination of what you might call the Dionysian and Apollonian elements in his life, in his music making, was very, very strongly marked. Incredibly so. You never were quite sure which Kubelik was going to turn up. There were times when he could be very, very strict and very, very almost obsessive in terms of detail. And then there were times when all hell would break loose and he could just be totally crazy. And it was no way to tell. I don't think he knew which one was going to show up until it happened. I remember particularly, listening to his Mahler cycle, at the Bavarian Radio, which had its ups and downs like every Mahler cycle does. And the Seventh Symphony was one of the quickest on disc. It was, like 65 minutes or something like that. But then when the New York Philharmonic published its Mahler box of Mahler performances, they had Kubelik doing the Seventh, and it was like 20 minutes slower, 15 minutes slower. It was as slow as Klemperer's. It was really unbelievable, the difference from that performance from the next. Now, some people would say, okay, well, one was a studio recording and one was live. I don't think it's that simple. In fact, I don't think it's that simple for most artists, whether it's studio or whether it's live. It's all about how they feel on the day and what they're bringing to the party at the time. But that New York Philharmonic Mahler Seventh is really, really unusual. And he could be like that. He really could be like that. It was a very, very interesting guy. I think that, so coming up with his 10 best recordings has been a very interesting and somewhat difficult job over these few months that I've been thinking about him and trying stuff out. You were never quite sure how it was going to turn out. And as often as not, it was quite good. Sometimes it was just terrible. He could be incredibly dull, at the same time that he could be absolutely thrilling. I mean, I say these things, and you might say to me, "Oh, okay, you're just generalizing. This is every conductor's that way. They could be thrilling or they could be boring." But with Kubelik, it seems to me that it was often in a very, very specific way. He just had either his interest in something was in the emotional expression, or it was in something else. I'm not sure what else it was. I can't really define what it was. But whatever the ultimate result, he was a magnificent, magnificent musician. He tends to get, another point I just wanted to raise before directing you to the Kubelik 10 Best Recordings video at classicstoday.com. He tends to get some sympathy because he was hounded out of Chicago by Claudia Cassidy, the feared critic in Chicago at the time. And I did a little talk about her and a little talk about Kubelik and his Mercury Living Presence recordings, because I've been covering these box sets as they've been coming out. So we've been talking about Kubelik quite a bit. And I have to say, and I said it then, I sided with Cassidy. He was not ready for prime time when he took over Chicago. That doesn't mean he didn't make some great records. He did. But he wasn't ready. I mean, if you look at his programming, he was really a bad conductor when it came to programming for a general subscription audience at a normal symphony orchestra. That was not going to be for him, because he didn't think about music that way at all. He really didn't. At least when he was with Bavarian Radio, like I said, he could make broadcast recordings and essentially do what he wanted and do things on a piece-by-piece basis. which was so much more satisfying for him, and I think it was much more comfortable as a result. But the odd thing about his tenure in Chicago was that because he was recording for Mercury Living Presence, and because those recordings became synonymous with audiophile standards, he became associated with, like Antal Dorati for Mercury. Now, Antal Dorati was a conductor who really cared about what records sounded like. And he was very interested in the sonics and making sure that he got excellent sonics. Kubelik wasn't. Kubelik didn't care about that stuff at all. So he was carried along in the early part of his career by his fame as a conductor in Chicago of these sonic blockbusters. But nothing could have been further from his personality than the sonic blockbuster populist repertoire kind of thing. That wasn't him at all. He was a musician's musician and a real introvert in terms of his personality, I think. And I also think that there was in his music an intense anger and nostalgia for what had happened in Czechoslovakia. He desperately loved his homeland, and I think throughout his career, one of the reasons he made such a point of playing this Czech music and playing it so well was not necessarily because he felt this inner affinity with Czech music. I mean, I'm sure he did, but I mean, he wanted to prove, he wanted to stick it in their eye, because his performances of Czech music, let me say, tend to have a certain urgency and a fire that's really, really pretty remarkable, especially when you compare it to typical Czech performances that came out of Czechoslovakia on Superfon. He really wanted to show them. And Munich was the perfect place to do it because they were like just over the border from the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia at that time. So he was sitting there in Munich, basically giving the finger to the folks across the border doing all of this Czech music. All of these things are part of his extremely complicated musical persona. And so it's going to be a great pleasure for me to go over the list of his 10 greatest recordings and explain to you why I chose them and see if you agree and if you know them as well as you should. I think, in my opinion. Some of it you may not like at all, because that's the way he was. I mean, he did some things that were very popular and some things that were not popular, deliberately so. And it was up to us to take it on his terms, not the other way around. Just a fascinating guy. I know this particular talk may be a little incoherent and rambling, because I just think that's the way he was, musically too. He's a very, very hard guy to pigeonhole. A very hard person to wrap your brain around, and the complexity that was this man. But my goodness, he left us a tremendous legacy, and it will be my joy to explain it to all of you ClassicsToday.com subscribers. So please consider joining if you haven't. Please give Kubelik a listen and keep on listening. Thank you for joining me, friends. Take care.